The first time Margaret Thompson made headlines, she was 26 years old, flying a Huey helicopter through tracer fire to extract a downed reconnaissance team outside Khe Sanh in 1969. Her call sign was Angel 9. Her nickname, given by those she pulled from burning jungle clearings, was the Angel of Khe Sanh. She didn't care much for either. She didn't fight for glory. She fought to get people home. 54 years later, in a town no reporter had visited in decades, Margaret, now known as Peggy, Thompson made headlines again. This time, there were no helicopters, no flak jackets, no distant thunder of war drums. Just a small-town gas station, an aging woman, and a group of men who thought they'd found someone easy to scare. Riverstone, Virginia wasn't a place that made noise. It lay tucked between the foothills and the Shenandoah Pines, the kind of town that lived one breath behind the world. There were 2 traffic lights, 1 hardware store, 3 churches, and a bar that hadn't changed its jukebox selection since the Reagan administration. People knew each other's dogs by name. Strangers stood out. The Shadow Vipers weren't from Riverstone. But they wanted it.N01 remembered exactly when they arrived. Maybe a year before the gas station. Maybe less. First came the roaring engines down Route 219, louder at night than they had any right to be. Then came the tattoos, the patched leather vests, the sudden rise in late-night fights and boarded-up shop fronts. Protection fees, whispers of meth drops, stolen copper wire from the plant. Law enforcement stayed quiet. Some said they were scared. Others said they were bawed. And no one stood up. Not until Peggy Thompson stood at pump number 4, gripping the handle with one hand and her cane with the other. The Vipers rolled up like they owned the lot, 3 of them, wearing sneers like trophies. The youngest one, with a shaved head and a spider tattoo across his neck, stepped too close. Called her Grandma. Made a joke about how long she'd last if she didn't pay for protection. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She just said, "Do you know what a minigun sounds like when it jams halfway through a strafing run?" He didn't answer. He wouldn't have known how. She said, "I do. I still dream about it." And then she pulled out a phone. Not one of those slick, glass-fronted jobs everyone carried. This one was older, beaten, with a scratched-up keypad and worn digits. It only had 5 numbers saved. She pressed 1.5 seconds past 10. Then she spoke into the receiver calmly. "Iron Jack. You remember Khe Sanh?" The answer was brief. "Yes, ma'am." She looked back at the 3 men, who were now just a little less confident, like dogs sniffing an unexpected scent. She said, "It's time," and hung up. Colonel Jack Morrison, retired, decorated, and reclusive, was 74 years old and still rode a 1999 Harley-Davidson Road King with exhaust that made windows tremble. He'd been called Iron Jack during the Gulf War, but to the men he led, he was just Jack. When Peggy had plucked him out of a bloodied LZ in 1969, he'd sworn that if she ever needed a favor, all she had to do was call. He didn't expect that call to come half a century later. But when it did, he moved. He didn't come alone. The Veterans Guard wasn't official. Not in any federal register. But every man and woman who wore its patch had once worn a uniform with pride and bled for something bigger than themselves. They weren't a gang. They didn't start fights. They didn't brag, but they didn't lose, and they didn't forget a debt. Within 24 hours, the first 6 members of the Veterans Guard rolled into Riverstone, quiet as ghosts. They didn't flash colors. They wore plain jackets, eyes sharp, posture straighter than most men half their age. By the end of the week, more had arrived, some on bikes, some in trucks, some bringing tools, some just hands ready to work. Peggy met them all. Knew most of them by name. She wasn't just a war story to them. She was the one who had flown into hell to bring them home. Now, they'd come back to bring home the town she loved. The Vipers didn't react at first. They laughed, called the veterans a retirement club. But soon, their jokes thinned. The veterans didn't challenge them directly. They simply started taking up space. One vet rebuilt the back fence at McCall's Feed and Grain after it had been mysteriously slashed for the third time that month. Another repaired a truck that had its brake lines cut. A former Navy corpsman began quietly handing out Narcan behind the pharmacy, slipping it into hands that knew where the real damage was being done. It was subtle, quiet, but relentless. Peggy organized it all from her front porch, where she sat with binoculars, a notebook, and a pitcher of sweet tea that never seemed to run dry. She didn't bark orders. She didn't need to. The veterans understood the terrain. Even if it was paved in asphalt instead of jungle, they began mapping every inch of the town. Who owned what? Who had been pressured? Who had caved? They didn't condemn. They just cataloged. With every note, a picture emerged. A battle plan. And then the second wave began. Evidence, surveillance, witness statements. The veterans began coordinating with out-of-town law enforcement, federal contacts, old favors from old wars. They worked quietly, bypassing the corrupted veins of Riverstone's municipal offices. They collected data, built timelines, tracked every asset the Vipers had touched. They didn't need to make arrests. They needed to prove. And then the Vipers struck back. It started with arson. The Veterans Guard headquarters, just an old auto shop turned meeting hall, went up in smoke one night. No one was hurt, but the message was clear: escalate or retreat. The veterans didn't flinch. They rebuilt the shop, stronger, reinforced. Cameras were hidden in plain sight. The wiring was fireproof. The blueprints had been drawn up by a former combat engineer from Kandahar who didn't believe in half measures. Then came the beating. A young Marine, barely out of his 20s, volunteering to distribute supplies to the local food pantry, was cornered by 3 Vipers behind the town laundromat. They broke his ribs. Left a note pinned to his chest. Go back to war. That night, the Veterans Guard held their first town meeting. Over 70 residents showed up. Some nervous. Some angry. All tired. Peggy spoke first. She didn't raise her voice. She said, "We have 2 options. We can be scared, or we can be ready." She pointed to the Marine in the front row, his arm in a sling, bruises under his eyes. "This is the last time one of ours gets hurt without a response." From that night on, the town changed. Not all at once, but visibly. Businesses stopped paying the Vipers. Sheriff's deputies, once hesitant, began responding faster. Cameras went up. Neighbors checked on each other. People locked arms in quiet ways, bringing groceries, leaving notes, walking children to school. And behind it all, the Veterans Guard watched. Documented. Advised. The Vipers panicked. They called for help. But what came wasn't help. It was worse. Havoc arrived 2 weeks later. No last name. Just reputation. A new leader, flown in from outside the state. Younger. Meaner. Backed by cartel connections, and a personal guard of mercenaries, dressed like bikers, but moving like soldiers. He wasn't interested in control. He wanted fear. And for a moment, it seemed like the balance would tip again. But Peggy knew better. She knew that the louder a man shouted, the more afraid he was. And when she saw Havoc's eyes at the community fair, where he'd swaggered through like a king inspecting subjects, she saw it: desperation. Because Riverstone wasn't scared anymore, and that terrified him. Havoc thought fear worked the same way everywhere. You showed up louder than the last guy, beat someone senseless in public, and the rest of the town would bow before you could even ask. That had been the formula in Alabama, New Mexico, Nevada. Small towns with too much pride and too little backbone. He'd watched sheriffs flinch when they saw him. Watched war veterans lower their eyes, remembering that battles were things you left behind, not restarted in your backyard. But Riverstone didn't lower its eyes. Not anymore. He noticed it in small ways first. The way business owners kept standing in their doorways after closing, not watching, just refusing to disappear. The way old-timers at the diner stopped talking when he walked in, not out of fear, but as a signal. The silence wasn't surrender. It was rejection. The way the deputy he tried to intimidate at the gas station simply stared back and said, "You want to file a complaint?" There was no submission. Just stillness. The kind that holds the line. He started digging. He thought he was dealing with a town full of has-beens and sheep. He didn't know yet that the quietest woman on Main Street had logged every visitor's license plate for 6 months and cross-checked it with interstate trafficking reports. He didn't know that half the local kids were flying hobby drones disguised as school projects, but feeding footage into a shared drive maintained by a former Navy intelligence analyst who repaired lawnmowers on the side. He didn't know that the city's electrical grid had been subtly re-engineered by a retired Army engineer to isolate every neighborhood block in case of forced outage. Havoc was up against something he didn't understand, and that scared him more than bullets. Peggy, for her part, never changed pace. She still walked to the post office every Tuesday morning, still tended her garden, still attended town hall meetings with a notebook full of concerns about sidewalk cracks and potholes. But behind every casual comment was layered intent. She didn't need to order the town to defend itself. She simply reminded people what they were protecting. And one by one, they stepped forward. The Veterans Guard didn't engage Havoc directly. They didn't challenge his dominance in public or bait him into street fights. Instead, they turned him into a ghost. A presence that no longer commanded dread, only irritation. They rerouted his shipments by coordinating with federal highway inspectors, having random weight checks posted just outside town on the days his couriers moved. They had the zoning board reassess properties being used by the Vipers as drop points, burying them in months of paperwork. They flagged suspicious insurance activity. All legal. All silent. All devastating. Havoc started losing income before he knew it was happening. When he retaliated, spray painting Peggy's mailbox with a crude insult and burning a Veterans Guard patch on the courthouse steps, the town didn't flinch. The next morning, every mailbox in town had a sticker, "We stand with Peggy." That week, 2 more former Vipers walked into the Veterans Guard headquarters and laid down their patches. "I didn't sign up to fight ghosts," one of them said. The Veterans Guard didn't recruit. They mentored, they listened, they offered pads out, but never begged, because they understood better than anyone that the hardest wars weren't fought with fists or firearms. They were fought in quiet rooms, between pride and conscience. Havoc responded the only way he knew how. Escalation. He brought in cartel muscle. Quiet men with military training and foreign passports. Not bikers. Professionals. He posted them at the Vipers safe house, converted it into an operations hub. For 2 weeks, he walked taller again. The whispers returned. The Vipers started driving through neighborhoods more often. At night, gunshots echoed once again in the distance, not aimed at anyone, just reminders, but something shifted. The cartel men didn't like Riverstone. Too many eyes. Too many layers. One of them disappeared for 6 hours during a scouting run. When he returned, he was pale and shaking, muttering something about an old lady with a revolver who knew my name before I said it. No one knew what Peggy had said to him, but he left town 2 days later. The others followed. Havoc was running out of moves. So he made the worst kind of decision. The desperate kind. He wired the old train depot. 600 pounds of explosives. Enough to level half the town. He wanted to send a message. He wanted fear to come back. He wanted the quiet broken, but someone tipped Peggy off. She didn't panic. She called Iron Jack, and within 4 hours, the entire operation had been mapped, isolated, and disarmed by a 2-man team that had once defused bombs in Kandahar using only duct tape and a Leatherman. They caught Havoc trying to flee. It wasn't even dramatic. He was found in a borrowed truck, halfway to the state line, crying behind the wheel. The real ending didn't come with sirens. It came with silence. When word got out that Havoc was in custody, no one cheered. They just breathed again. And that was enough. In the days that followed, Riverstone didn't celebrate. They rebuilt. The Veterans Guard didn't dissolve. They transitioned. Set up a civic outreach center. Began counseling programs for at-risk youth. Created partnerships with local law enforcement. They didn't take over. They reinforced. They helped the town build something that could stand even without them. Because they wouldn't be there forever. Peggy turned 91 that winter. The mayor wanted to throw her a ceremony. She refused. Instead, she asked for benches to be installed at 3 of the town's busiest corners. She didn't want plaques. She wanted places for people to sit, to talk, to stay visible. Because that was what Riverstone had become, not a fortress, but a community that could see itself. People still talked about the gas station moment, how 3 men tried to scare a woman who'd once flown helicopters through gunfire and ended up becoming the fuse for a resistance they never saw coming. They asked her later what she was thinking when she made the call. Peggy always gave the same answer. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about how many people I had left to protect. The third spring came quiet, and stayed that way. Riverstone had grown used to quiet now. Not the anxious kind that used to follow trouble down the road like smoke from an unseen fire, but a different kind, settled, unshaken, earned. The sort of quiet you notice only after it's been gone a long time. The kind that isn't afraid of breaking. Because it knows how to be rebuilt. By then, most of the town had forgotten the exact details of what happened at the gas station. Not because it wasn't important. Everyone remembered the outcome, but because memory had softened the edges. Now, kids just knew that something dark had tried to take Riverstone once. And something older, stronger, and quieter had said no. They knew the woman who'd sat in the sun outside the post office every Tuesday, a thermos of coffee in her lap, was more than she appeared. Some called her Miss Peggy. Others, Mrs. Thompson. But most, especially the veterans, called her what she'd always been, Angel. Peggy never liked being called a hero. That was for other people. For men who'd bled out on landing zones, and boys who'd flown home in pine boxes. She had just done her job. In Vietnam, and here. In both cases, she'd stepped in when nobody else would. And in both cases, she'd never once thought she'd be the one to make it out, but she had. And then she'd built something worth staying for. After Havoc's arrest, and the collapse of the Viper's grip, Riverstone didn't erupt in celebration. There were no banners, no block parties, no dramatic speeches. That wasn't their way. The closest thing to a victory lap was the sound of someone hammering a loose piece of siding back onto a barn while 2 neighbors stood nearby sipping from thermoses, saying nothing, just nodding every few minutes like they were syncing heartbeats. Peggy never took credit for any of it. Even when reporters tried to come around, drawn in by rumors of the town the cartel couldn't crack, she turned them away with a single line. You're not here to listen. You're here to sell a story. This place already has one. And that was that. The Veterans Guard stayed. Not as a militia. Not as muscle. Just as people. As mentors. As neighbors. Jack Morrison, Iron Jack, ended up buying a little house off Quarry Lane, right behind the park. His knees weren't what they used to be, but he still rode his bike most days, the engine purring like a memory he didn't want to let go of. He and Peggy would sit sometimes in the late afternoon, not talking much. Just watching kids play basketball at the rec center the town built after the Vipers left. The center had been funded by a mix of town funds, a quiet donation from the Veterans Guard, and something Peggy arranged without ever writing her name on the check. She didn't want a plaque. She just wanted it done. And it was. The building had steel-reinforced doors, medical kits in every room, and a community kitchen that doubled as a storm shelter. On the surface, it was a youth center. Underneath, it was a fortress of care. That was what Riverstone had become, Not paranoid, not militarized. Just prepared, vigilant, resilient. You could see it in the way people acted. Someone parked a strange car in front of the elementary school too long? It was reported within 10 minutes, not out of fear, but concern. Someone saw a drone flying too low over the old depot. 2 teenagers had the serial number by sundown and passed it to the guard, who quietly cross-checked it with state surveillance logs. A flat tire at the edge of town? Within 20 minutes, someone was there offering a jack and a thermos of coffee. It wasn't just protection. It was culture. The Veterans Guard started hosting community nights at the town hall. CPR training, first aid, even classes on how to safely operate radios and prepare emergency kits. But more than that, they just listened. They'd sit in the back during town council meetings. Not interfering. Just present. Like a heartbeat that didn't stop even when you weren't thinking about it. The former Vipers, at least the ones who stayed, weren't ignored either. Kyle was the first. He'd helped torch a car belonging to a local vet once. He admitted it during the community reconciliation meeting, which Peggy had organized and chaired without saying much. She just opened the room and let people speak. And Kyle stood up. Apologized. Not with tears or theatrics. Just a low voice, shaking hands, and the truth. I was lost, he said. And angry. But this place, it didn't throw me out. It made space. I want to earn it now. He went on to apprentice with Mr. Holloway, the town's only certified mechanic. Within 6 months, Kyle was running the shop on weekends. By year 2, he was teaching high school students how to do brake jobs and change oil. He stopped wearing the Viper ink in public. Never denied it, just didn't need it anymore. Others followed. Not many, but enough. The town didn't forget what they'd done. But it didn't chain them to it either. Peggy once said, during a community dinner, people change. That's what makes them dangerous. But it's also what makes them worth saving. She said it softly, then went back to buttering her cornbread like she hadn't just rewritten someone's life with a sentence. When she turned 94, the mayor tried to give her a parade. She refused. Said she didn't want music. She wanted benches. Real ones. Places where people could sit and talk and notice each other again. 6 benches went up around town that spring. Each one had a different quote from Peggy, chosen by the townspeople. The one outside the clinic said, "Pay attention to what doesn't move. That's where the trouble hides." The one at the fairgrounds, "Quiet isn't weakness. It's what keeps you from wasting bullets." And outside the school, one simple sentence, "You don't have to be fearless. Just useful." They became places people met. Teenagers sat there after school. Retirees brought chessboards. Sometimes, when a neighbor passed away, someone would leave a flower on the bench. Just one. That was enough. Then, on a morning that felt too sunny to carry sorrow, Peggy Thompson passed in O hospital. No machines. Just her porch, a blanket over her knees, and the dog curled up at her feet. She'd fallen asleep with her notebook open. No one knew what she'd been writing, but the last line read, "I think we held the line long enough. They can carry it now." They buried her under the dogwood tree she'd planted without explanation years before. No monument. Just a bench beside it. The town closed early that day. Not out of obligation. Out of reverence. Iron Jack spoke. He looked smaller than he used to, a little more fragile. But his voice didn't shake. "She didn't teach us how to fight. She reminded us why we still could." No one clapped. They didn't need to. After the burial, the town didn't fall into silence. It stepped forward. Slowly. Gently. Like it knew it had to take a turn now. To hold the ground she'd once kept alone, the Veterans Guard remained. But they stopped calling themselves that. They were just community members now. Quiet stewards. They wore their jackets less. Didn't need to remind anyone who they were. Riverstone's younger generation grew up different than most. They weren't hard. They weren't paranoid. But they were aware. When one of the older kids asked his history teacher what the shadow vipers were, the answer was simple. They were something that didn't belong. And we reminded them of that. But Peggy's name? That lived longer. People told stories. Some true. Some exaggerated. That she once drove a four-wheeler into a cartel outpost and walked out with their radios. That she taught a hawk to follow her and use it to scout. That she once scared a DA agent off her porch with a stare so cold it set off a motion sensor. But the real story always came back to one thing. She had a phone, and she knew who to call. And when no one else knew what to do, she stood still, looked trouble in the eye, and didn't blink. That was Riverstone's inheritance. Not weapons, not warriors, but clarity, courage in quiet form, a community that knew how to bend before it broke. That knew how to fight without becoming what it fought. Years later, someone asked Jack, long since retired, if Riverstone would ever need another Peggy. He said no. Not because she can't be replaced, but because she didn't build a legacy. She built successors. And he wasn't wrong. The benches stayed, the tree bloomed, the lions held, and somewhere, in the way the wind moved through the hills at night, you could almost hear a Huey in the distance. Not coming. Just remembering. Like the land itself had decided to keep the story going.